You've heard me talking to you. I come from Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. We are about 2.5 hours outside of Chicago, or pretty much to the west, southwest of Chicago. We're a small private liberal arts college, 2,500 students, all undergrads, pretty much all residential, very few commuters. So we are a traditional campus, if you want to look at it that way. We know our market niche, we know it pretty well. There are other schools in our market area that do other types of things and do it very well, continuing education, the weekend stuff, all those sorts of revenue streams. So we've stuck with what we do pretty well. So that's my background. I've been a web guy since about 1997 when one of our IT folks who was pretty bright looked at this thing and went, "Does this look like a communication medium to you?" And I went, "Yeah, it kind of does." I said, I think you should take care of it instead of me. So that was, I'll take care of your server. You should probably take care of our website. So that's my background. Today we're going to talk about card sort. Are there people in here that have sat into my card sort before? Yeah, a few. Nothing new, folks. You can move on. Nothing new happening here. But I do talk really fast, right? So you don't get it all the first time, typically. So we're going to talk about card sort. I'm kind of a card sort evangelist. And I think you'll see why as you take a look at what this methodology is. This is not the only methodology that I would say is super simple and one of those things that you just have to do. But let's kind of talk through this. Card sort is a quantitative research method. You're going to get hard data from using a card sort. It has value to a lot of people, right? It's the stick you could carry into the meeting and say, we did research, and the research says this. As opposed to somebody saying, well, I think I like this for navigation, or, gee, I think we should use these particular terms on the site because I've seen that somewhere and I like those. I like that word. It's not a good way to basically build your navigation. And what you're going to find is card sort, it won't build your wireframe, but it will certainly influence your navigation scheme on your website. That's what the tool is used for, and it's very simple to use. So the basics. It informs your site navigation and architecture, which is the point I was just making. One of the mistakes I see here is people try to do these enormous card sorts, and they turn their card sort into basically their site architecture. You cannot test enough terms to do that. But you can test certain pieces of it, and this research will inform that. When do you use it? You use it if you're going to redesign your site. I would say tweaks in the site so you can test what you already have up. Right? How about test a subsection of your site that maybe you're going to rebuild? You're going to rebuild student services, or whatever you call it. And then the real question is that what high school students, if you want them to find it, call it? If you're going to rebuild that, I would be testing terminology specifically within that section of the site. This is kind of the easy part, right? I'm a communications guy, by the way. I teach public relations and I teach advertising classes. I'm a full-time administrator that's also a faculty member. Who? We're back to the simple part that anytime we deal with a communication medium, who's your audience? Test your audience. Test those key target audiences. This isn't a random kind of thing where you draw some people in. You want to focus. Sample sizes are pretty small here, and you're going to see that. And basically what I'm covering here is I'm going to tell you how to do it. I'm also going to share some results from a card sort that we did a few years ago, and you're going to see that my sample size is not very big. And I'll tell you kind of then we'll get to the, based on research, how big it really needs to be. So what is this thing? We're going to get to that. Basically, it's exactly what it sounds like. See these things? Probably held one of these in your hand at one time or another. This is an index card. Card sort is nothing more complex than me handing you this deck, and I'll give you the instructions in a moment on what to do with it. It's that simple to use. They're just some cards. Pretty low budget. I think this was like 48 cents at Walmart for this little stack of cards, so there's your budget for your test. If your department won't handle it, you might want to pay for it out of your own pocket because the data might be worthwhile, right? Okay. By the way, if you have questions as we go along, I do talk fast and I'm loud, but you can stop me. I'm an interactive kind of teacher. So as we get going here, if you've got questions or comments, let me know. We talked about when you do it. If you really want to do this, preferably before you start to work on a website. I'll tell you that we were actually in design mode when we did ours. We had an outside design company already starting to design. I already thought I knew what our site architecture was going to be. Let's just say it changed. So how do you do it? The traditional way works something like this. I picked on you before, didn't I? So here's how the card sort works. I come to my, and let's assume that this is for high school students. They're my prospective students, although I'm going to prove to you that that's a bad term. We tested that in this particular exercise, and many other people have tested it, so it wasn't a surprise that they have no idea what that term means. So you're a high school student. I've got you sat down. The way to do this with paper is simply this. What I've got here is a stack of cards, and this particular stack of cards has some terms that you typically might see on a college or university website. What I'd like you to do with this stack of cards is to sort them into piles that you think would go together, that might be common. If there's one that has a title that you think is really describes the whole pile, put it on top. If you have any cards that are in here, and those cards, they're either terms that you don't know, or you don't think they fit in this, I'd like you to set those off to the side. And then once you get done doing that, I've got some blank cards and a marker here. And what I'd like you to do with that is I'd like you to put a title on any of the piles that don't have something that describes them. I'd like you to write that term down and put it on there. And when you're done with that, just call me over and I'll come over and collect the cards. Think you could all do that? Pretty simple, right? I'd hand her the cards and she would start the sort. This can also be done electronically. And there's a number of pieces of software. One of my student developers is working on an open source piece of card sort software that's web-based. He has a poster session here. Stop and see Tim and ask him. He's working on the kind of the number crunching end of the tool right now. He would welcome any help or anybody else that would like to contribute to his project. So it can be done on a computer too. And the last time that we did it on a computer, and we used the card sort and card cluster. I will tell you this was developed by somebody working on his PhD, I think University of Chicago. He's hard to get a hold of. I think it's a whole $50 for a license once you can actually get him to respond. So it's a pretty reasonable tool to buy the usage rights to. And that works pretty simple. Basically, it's the same process. You give the same instructions. Somebody just happens to be sitting at a computer, and they can drag and drop the cards. They can move them to different piles. In that particular case, I tell them to make a pile, an electronic pile of the terms that they don't understand or don't think fit in. In that particular tool, once they're done with the piles, we have them call us over. So it's a little bit different because I have to click through a couple of screens, and then I have them put a title on the top of each of their piles. So they can't sort a card on top that would give me that information. Works much the same way. The cool part about that was, of course, the data was already in the computers, and you could actually, we did it on multiple machines. This is something people typically do by themselves. So your subject does this alone. Even if you have 6 kids that come in at the same time, you're going to want to set them on separate computers. It's an individual thing. We'll talk about how it can work as a group thing, but it's a completely different test than what we're talking about here. It is a tool, and it's a different way to use this. That was kind of cool because the data was already in and nobody had to input the data, and we could just quickly run it through an analysis tool. What we're looking for are cards that are commonly sorted into piles, right? This is simple cognitive behavior stuff. By the way, this research methodology well predates the web. This comes out of the libraries. Do I have any librarians in here? Comes from library science. You know what they used it for? Can you guess? Card catalog, right? Because they needed to know what terms people would go to the big file drawers and look for a particular topic. Makes sense, right? So what terms go together that would make sense to file a book under? So cross-referencing. was what this test was designed for. Very simple, very basic behavioral kind of thing. Okay. Here's a sample of some of the cards. You can really only use about, by the way, for people that participate, you'll get something.
Okay.
So. And there's more.
Okay.
You can use about, typical deck is about 90 cards. 90 cards is a pretty comfortable sort for most people. It's not very many terms, right? 80, 90 cards. If you're testing, let's say we were going to build an intranet, and I was working with internal audiences, and they were on, they're basically at work, then I might be able to ask them to sort a slightly bigger deck, but I'll tell you, 200 cards is a pretty tough sort. So even there, I'd probably try to keep it to 150 cards, but they're on the clock, so they're working, so they really can't say that they're not going to do the test, right? So I was testing for some specific things. I had some terms that were in this thing that I was just trying to find out where does a high school student put these? Where do things like art go? Is art an extracurricular? Is it an academic department? I don't know. I mean, I can assume what it is to me, but I'm not the audience. And that's the whole key to this, is you're testing the real audience on this. Let me see, interesting cards that were in here. Let's see if I've got anything. You're going to find some I tested FAQ. I have an interesting result on that one. Arts, I was testing things like, I really wanted to know if students preferred the term athletics or sports. So I put in those two terms, plus I put in some things that might go along with them, like intramurals, club sports, varsity sports, those sorts of things. So I was only testing some specific things that I thought I really needed help with in this particular thing. So you have to be real careful. And that's there's a little art to this. And the art, if anything, is how you select your cards. I ran basically two of these, same sort, same card deck. One of the groups comprised area high school students. They were freshmen through seniors. None of them were engaged in a search process with Augustana. I had a second sample, and that sample were students that were high school seniors. They had been accepted at Augustana. They were on my campus for scholarship interview. Admissions office, my office lived in their area for a long time, so I have a pretty close relationship with them. So it's pretty easy for them to do this. Plus, actually, those students a lot of times have an hour to kill here or there. They're waiting between interviews. So it gave them something kind of fun to do. And they knew that they were helping us work on our website. Sample doesn't need to be any bigger than this. Matter of fact, about 10 or 12, somebody was in my workshop the other day was saying they found that 8 is kind of their threshold. Pardon me. That at 8 people, once you start to test more than that, your results don't change much. So you can test a whole bunch of people, not really going to change your results. Kind of like the Jacob Nielsen usability testing, right? 5 people, results don't change. We already talked about the procedure. You can tell I don't necessarily pay attention to my slides, because it really doesn't matter, right? We're just kind of covering the topic. We talked about how this will happen. Let me pause before I talk about our results. Any questions on the process or procedure?
I'm sorry, I tend to be a little thick at times. The data that went on the cards, was that just from you going out and looking at different sites and the terms that they use? So it was all from your perspective? Was there usability at all that went into that? Some other process, or how did the cards get?
So the question was, where did the cards come from? Does that just come from my knowledge? Did I go out and look at other sites? Was usability a factor? Yes, 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 yes.
Okay.
We actually did something I'm not covering here, but we do an exercise on our campus. We've done it, I think, 4 or 5 times now for different reasons, that we just call comparative data analysis. We use an Excel spreadsheet and we look at 50 to 100 other schools, and we just look at things like, what are the navigation terms that you find on all of these sites? And it ends up being this huge spreadsheet that influenced some of the cards that we use. Some of them were terms that we were already using. Some were terms that we were considering using based on some paradigms that we were starting to see. wanted to see if they work. And some of it just is kind of, it's like, I have a feeling this is clunky, so it's a gut feel that maybe high school students don't, I'm not getting them to where they need to go. I'd like to tell you it was based on site analytics and that I have these drill down stats. We've never had a tool that good on our campus. As much as I'd love to have one, I don't have that. Otherwise, that would be really useful, right? There might be an area on my site that I think is really important for people to see, and if nobody's going there, I'd love to test and see what terms may actually get people to look for the type of information. So I'd have to have the information type words. I'd have to have that term that I'm using that I know doesn't work. Maybe some alternates, and what would be above it. Because I want to see if they're maybe coming in a stack. Or maybe that above it is the blank that they might fill in. Right? So it's a choice, right? Like I said, this is an art. That's the tricky part. Go ahead.
Quick question. If we wanted to do card sort, do you think it would be a valuable sample if we use, say, our PR class to do it as a class project? Because our students come from a very diverse population, say, from a rural population, but also many students, if you will, also come from urban populations. So we get this mixture, but that mixture might not happen until they're actually in the classroom, or would that skew the results because now they're undergraduate students?
Yeah, the question is, how would I feel about using students like in a PR class to do that? Because they maybe are a better representative sample than the students that you might be able to use as high school students.
High school, because that's
the real difference is they're already engaged in the process. They're a step further, so you may have already trained them, even though it was hard, to use terms that are on your site. I would go out and go to a couple of different schools that represent those. It's worth the trip. And I'll tell you what, I've gone into high schools and done all sorts of different types of testing. High schools are really pretty cool about letting you come in. A lot of times they'll do it like in a business class or something like that, and you'll go in and you'll do the tests in front of them. There I would probably use DEX, right? And then I would say, okay, I don't know what your results are, but here's how I'm going to use that data. And you just kind of make it a little educational thing. You get 10 piles of cards. And then I would come, what I do is I always have paper clips and a rubber band. And so like when I was picking up her cards, I would have paper clipped the piles together, and then I'd put hers in a set so that I knew what her set was so that I could input the data later. Yeah, you really have to we're back to that audience. It's really important to really get that audience at the point that you think they might be engaging with your site, because that's what you're trying to figure out. In the back.
Did you arrive at the guideline that the answers need to be individual through early theory on card sorts or through your personal practice? Because I was once part of a group card sort and it was a fiasco.
Yeah, the question was about group card sort as opposed to individual. There's actually a fair amount of what for me would be secondary research, so not my research. Other people have tested it too. I have actually experienced both though, and I've done a group card sort. Let me change direction. Let me talk about it, and we'll come back to what I really consider card sort. Group card sort. A group card sort, this stuff that I get back, this quantitative data that I'm talking about, has absolutely no value. What has value in a group card sort, if I set 4 girls that are friends down to do a card sort, and they do it as a group, what has value is the qualitative discussion that they have, because it may give you some insights into how their minds are working in the search process. But this actually has no value. This is a tool to actually get something else. So the fact they're doing a card sort, I hate to even call that one a card sort, because I'm not really after that data. You're right, it is a fiasco. You really can't do this as a group. Because you don't surf websites necessarily. I mean, you don't look at websites as a group typically. Your audience isn't going to do that. If we lived in Japan, it would be different, right? And they've changed now. But their paradigm, if you go back 3 years, was students in Japan very seldom sat down at a computer as an individual and did any of this sort of thing. It was always more of a social event. So your culture impacts this. So I'm not going to tell you that this may, move from country to country, that there may be some cultural differences in this process. But for the most part in the United States, our students, as they come to our websites, are doing it by themselves. So let me tell you about some of the things that we found out in our card sort. This first one that I have up here, it says general information. This was the biggest epiphany that we had from this. We were in a site redesign, I already mentioned that. We were working with an outside company. They were required to supply us with 6 different designs from 3 different designers, 2 designs each per designer. Then we would take those to what we call paper testing. We had this really, really bad term on our website that was there for a lot of years in the main navigation called welcome. It was my fault. I put it there. I knew it was bad. I needed eventually some research to get rid of it, but it was there a long, long time. Our website was really highly rated, so if there's anybody in here with that still on there, it's my fault. Because a lot of people went, hey, Augustana has this really highly rated website. We were written up here and there. So a lot of people adopted that bad navigation. Ugh. So we were ready to replace this about 3.5 years ago, and we were going to replace it with about. Now, we're Augustana. We like A's. We had athletics. We had academics. We love A terms. So I needed something. Welcome had like all the stuff in it. It's where maps were at and all those sorts of things. I'm going to replace it with about. It's short. It's an A word. Of course, that's where you would put all that stuff. It was really clear in the card sort because general information was not a card. But 11 out of 20 of these students put down something that was either that or something close to it. So it was a write-in. You want to talk about just kind of whacking you over the head. Pretty obvious. And when I looked at it, it's like, that's exactly what this stuff is. It's general information. It's directions to campus. It's campus maps. It's a welcome for the president. All that stuff. That's where it goes. Absolutely. We did follow-up research to this. We went back to some of these students and asked them. And so one of the questions that we asked them, this was personal, like telephone, one-on-one, just me saying, hey, I'm following up. I got a couple of questions for you. We asked, so what about the term about? They all had a definition for it. It was really the same thing. About, that's what you find on everybody's website. It's like 3-4 paragraphs that tells me about who you are. It's not general information. So it's really obvious now, right? Of course it's obvious. You don't, this is the term that you should use. That was our big takeaway. So we had to go back to the designers that already had designs done and had this little word in the navigation and say, oh, by the way, you need to change that little word to 2 big words. Well, they did it. So that was my biggest, if you had a takeaway from the conference, that was huge. To find the same piece of information, it could be under 3 or 4 different terms. So I wanted to test that. And I was really hoping one of these would come up and would be like the thing. None of them was. Courses actually came up a little more often, but not enough to be significant. So there was no preference for whatever that thing is that describes the academic curriculum or whatever that's happening in that department. Sports and athletics, there was no preference. Once again, these are the things I was after, right? I wanted there to be, so I had a bias, but there was no preference. So the data makes that pretty clear. So you pick whichever one. And in this particular case, there were some political reasons to stick with athletics, which we had called it. Although our athletics people, they would like to tell you that that's only varsity athletics. And my argument there is most of our students have been involved as athletes somewhere in high school. I'm not going to tell them just because you aren't going to play varsity sports that you're not an athlete anymore. So if we call it athletics, it also needs to have links to get to other types of programs like club sports and intramurals, things like that. Student activities. This was almost another one that was kind of so good information, but that there was some variation as to what would get sorted maybe in there. That one still wasn't super clear. There was a lot of variety I put here. This is some of the best parts. These are what I call non-results. Remember those cards we sorted out? FAQ? Not one of them I really understood what that term meant. So if that's a navigation term on your website, bad navigation term. Would they understand frequently asked questions? Possibly. Didn't test it that way. I tested FAQ. And FAQ did not work. It was mostly a sort out card. Intramurals. Wow, this one really kind of got me too. They had no idea what that was. Apparently they don't do intramurals in high school. It's been way too long since I was in high school. They really did not know what that term meant. I think like 2 sorted it into a pile where we thought it might fit. I was really interested to see if it was going to show up in student activities or sports or athletics. And then to have it sorted out, I was really kind of disappointed on that one too. But it's like, okay, so that's pretty obvious. If I want to tell people about other things, maybe I need to be talking about sports in general, and then they might click on it just to find out what it is, because it's in the context of other sports. If it's just floating out there in student activities with organization names like student government, intramurals, they're not going to go there. The about we talked about, computing services. That was another one. It just kind of, we could not, there was not a term that identified what we would hope would come up.
So what did you end up going with?
I don't even remember. That was one where it's like, you know what, it doesn't matter because they really. So if we could turn this into a task, it would be better, right? So if you could rephrase it and say, find out about, about your computer or something like that, then it's a task that might make sense to them. It was one of those. Some of these you just kind of give up and you're like, you know what? IT can call that whatever they want because it's not going to matter because students aren't finding it until they come on campus and maybe ask it, and then somebody directs them to go there. Now, we didn't go up, there's no answer for that. And there's stuff you want to tell them, right? Because there's stuff they actually want to know. So, what's the connection like in my room? Do I have to have it turned on? Do I have to pay extra for the connection? What are the other services that are available on your campus? How many computers are there in labs? And they want to know that stuff. I'm not sure how to get them there. If somebody's done a more recent card sort, it'd be kind of cool to see if maybe we've taught them a term. We actually put prospective students as a card in the deck. I pretty much knew what was going to happen here. This isn't new research, folks. Lots of people have tested this term in usability labs. I think the first time I saw results was like in 1999 from Indiana University, who, by the way, have 2 usability labs on their campus. And they knew it didn't work. This is our term for them, right? It's stupid to think that this would work. This is what we call them. That's not what they call themselves. They don't say, I'm a prospective student. Right?
What do they call them?
They're not prospective. That's a really good question. And I'll tell you, give me a second, and I'm going to get to another little piece of this research. Okay, any good research geek? Do I have other research geeks in here? Come on, I gotta have a few, right? Okay, I got some. Any good research geek always puts qualitative research on with their quantitative because we're trying to sneak a little bit in because sometimes there's some other things we'd like to find out. We asked 6 questions. So when we did this sort, we actually gave them like a bag of goodies. So we had a little bit of expense. We gave them a bag, some swag. We gave them some tchotchke stuff as they left. And so when they got done with their card sort, we said, hey, we've got one more thing for you to do. We've got 6 questions. They were simple. On one page, do these, and we're going to use this page then, put your name on it, because we're going to use this as a drawing, because 2 of the 10 of you are going to get sweatshirts besides your bag of stuff that you got. So we asked these questions. We collected a little more data. So we asked, what does the phrase future student mean to you? This is what a lot of people went with when the research was very clear that prospective student didn't work, right? Ooh, they're future students. 0 out of 20 answer. If you're using this on your website, 0 out of 20 of my test group answered this in the way you would like them to answer it. Although it was very clear that they knew what this meant. Future students are people that have selected your school but are not there yet. So they're people in about 3-month window, right? It's somewhere between sending in their tuition deposit and arriving on your campus. That was very consistent. That's exactly who that is. That's not them. What does the phrase prospective student mean to you? 1 out of my 20 students did answer this in the way you would like them to answer it if you use this as a navigation term. My guess is she looked at some other schools and she learned that somehow or another she was a prospective student. Am I going to now? Let me qualify this. If, and I've never seen this happen with anybody's test so far, it would be possible to say that my school's in a region where everybody uses it. They don't think they probably do. Everybody uses it, and therefore, this is a term that all students know. Nobody's hard research has ever proven that. Do some hard research and you prove it to me, I would go, okay, that's cool. They understand it. Go ahead.
Does that vary for graduate level students? Or we're graduate only?
Graduate students are really different. Graduate students, because they have been students, have a real different understanding. In grad school, and of course I don't do that, I have been privy to some other people's graduate student research, at least a couple of them, and their terminology that they use, and I don't remember what terms, but they have some terms that they're a little more savvy. Actually, you can almost, from what we saw, you could use a little more variation for them, because they're a little smarter about the process and they can make their way through it. So no, this is undergrad.
This may be off the track, so.
Off track is fine.
Okay. One of the things that we've been battling with for a number of years is the wisdom in doing what I call role-based navigation on websites. In other words, for students, for faculty, for alumni. Do you have any research that shows the value or lack of value?
Yeah, her question is on what she's calling role-based research. I call it task-based. What was somebody was calling it something else in the workshop the other day? Subject-based.
Personas.
Yeah, although that has a different connotation. But we know there is behavioral. If you go back to simple behavioral research from your psych classes, especially consumer behavior classes, if you think about it from the customer standpoint, they come to your website with a task in mind. So if your navigation helps them get to their task, that's what they're after. To ask them to identify themselves as an audience is a little tougher. Some people, it depends on their engagement with you. So if I'm an internal audience or I'm an alumnus, there I might want to identify myself. So in a way I'm going to go, oh, actually I think alumni look for themselves as an audience. But they're kind of an outlier but they're tied to you, right? The difference here is that these people, how long do I have? Okay, let me explain the shopping basket paradigm, which I did in my workshop real quickly. Basic behavioral marketing psychology. When customers go to buy something, any product that we buy, we start with a product. So I'm going to buy a new car. I've read an article in a magazine, and I say I'm going to buy a Toyota Camry. Or not that I'm going to buy it, I'm going to look at a Toyota Camry, it's highly rated. And my neighbor has a Honda Accord, and he really likes it. And then there's this Tschopp guy that used to work in the car business, and he's driving a Mitsubishi Galant. I've now looked for things to put into my market basket that I will now do the research. I'll go through the rest of the process. There's a 5-step process to buying anything. You all go through it every time, even if it's a sandwich for lunch, or whether it's a car. It's the same process. It's just the timeline smushes, right? So that's the process. We look for things to put in our market basket that we can shop with. Here's the difference. When people are shopping for a school, a lot of times they start with a piece of criteria that's much wider. I will look at schools within a 3-hour drive of my home. My market basket now includes 103 schools. So the difference is I'm looking for any reason I can to chuck some of these out because I can't manage that in my head. So the market basket paradigm is almost opposite in our industry than for most any other product that way. So in a roundabout way that I'm answering your question, right? So your audience, like prospective students in particular, they're at a low engagement level. They're actually looking for reasons to eliminate you, not to include you, because That's kind of their process. So no, it really wasn't off topic. It's kind of what we're after here, right? We're after good navigation. This is all about the user. We're back to user. Go ahead.
We just talked to 5 students that came in from other countries, and they were all mad because we don't have prospective students on our webpage.
So, did you hear his comment? Students from other countries, they were mad because they didn't have it on their webpage. Am I saying that you shouldn't have this? I'm saying, I think the best solution, and this is just from all this stuff, kind of being exposed to it, task-based is still going to be the best navigation, especially for your low-engaged audience. It's actually your most important audience. Can you still have audience-based navigation? Yes. Maybe it should be in a different place. It should be secondary. It should be left column, or it should be underneath the other. Because some people still, when we do research, we're talking about a large aggregate group, and then there's all these individual outliers. And we're trying to make the website easy for them to use, too. And there are some people that may be able to identify themselves. Now, they're not future students. They're not prospective students. What would you call yourself? I'm 17 years old. If I had to identify myself as an audience, what do you think I'd look for?
Why come?
What's that?
Why come?
Yeah, no, she said, why come here? You just changed it into a task. Last year when I did this session, I had somebody from the University of Indiana who I hadn't seen for like 4 years, and he said in all their testing, and they test, they turned it into a task. And I think they turned it into become a student. So they changed it into a task-based. Another way to do it, it's clunkier, right? It's not a term. For us, high school student, transfer student, international student. Much easier, they can identify. They know kind of what's happening there. So there's ways around it. None of them are perfect. And did I test that? No. That we did more out of intuition, and there I really looked at other people's research. I knew the prospective student and future student weren't necessarily good. So how else am I going to identify them if I'm going to have some audience-based nav? And ours is really secondary, or audience-based. So, on a college website, what's the first thing you want to know? I did this, I pretty much knew what this was. It's always been the same thing, no matter whose research I look at, whether it's Staymates or whoever's out there doing research. This has not really changed, folks. It's been the same for a long, long time. Students come to your website and they want to find out, do you have my major? Can I afford to be there? Will I fit in? There are some other questions. Once again, there's some outliers in this group. If I'm academically maybe not golden, if some of my friends are looking at Augustana and they're much better students than I am, I may go try to find information on just whether you'd accept me or not. Because I might not even care if you have my major. Because my friends are going there. If I think I can get in, I'm going to apply. I'll pick a major sometime, right? But pretty much majors, and I've just seen, this past year, we've seen research from 2 companies that we work with that tested that basically the same thing comes up again. Number one thing, they want to know, do you have my major? That's real confusing, right? We had one of my friends that couldn't be at the conference this year did a card sort, and on their campus, large campus, they really used the card sort to demonstrate to their internal audiences that the external audiences did not understand the silos that they put their academic departments in. Because nobody there would believe it. Of course people would look for communication here. Of course it's in this college and the university. Of course, if you think about it, it's pretty easy to understand that's different everywhere you go. And if you expect somebody to drill down and find it, they're not going to find it. So they used a card sort with some different types of cards, basically to prove where these pieces would fall, and that none of the users understood it. We asked them to list the 5 other things that are most important to have on a college website. It was just a big variety of stuff, kind of what we expected. This is more of the personal interest stuff. They're looking for choir. They're looking for wrestling. They're looking for a Latino group on campus. You know, they're looking for certain things that they think they might be want to connect with on campus. I get contacts every now and then, but those are lower things, right? I advise 2 student groups, so I get students, every now and then I'll get an email from a student that's interested in advertising. Because I advise a student group that does an advertising competition. But those are kind of low, and those don't happen near as much. I'd love to get more of those emails. Have you looked at any college websites yet? This was really just for my own personal information, right? I just kind of know, and if so, which ones were they? Kind of curious who else they were looking at. I talked about that data analysis sheet we do. That gives me some clues to some other schools maybe I might want to look at. Questions? Wow, nothing? Go ahead.
I know that you mentioned that you don't use analytics a lot, but are you a proponent of doing A/B testing? Meaning, I put one label up for a few weeks, and then switch it out with another label and compare. If people get to the content that they're looking for.
Everybody, her question was about, she called it A/B testing, like change a label on the website, put it up for a few weeks and change it. I think people on our campus would scream if we were changing any navigation terms. But that's one that would be pretty easy to test in a simple usability lab study, not a sophisticated lab. I'd sit 3 students down and have them do a task where they would probably use it, and I'd sit 3 other students down and at the slightly redesigned one, have them test it and see kind of where they go. You know, that basic usability testing, you can also do that on the cheap if you don't have a lab. You can't have the designer do it, because the designer is going to want to go, that's the link, stupid, if they're standing in the room. So you can't have them there. But you can simply do it. I mean, I was doing usability testing in 1998. We didn't have a name at the time. Jacob Nielsen wasn't out there saying usability. But I'm a marketing guy, right? And you test things. And I had no other way, but I had high school students in my basement almost every day. So I'd get home at night, and there'd be, because my kids were that age, dragging them up. We had some websites that we built just 2 to 3 levels down in some certain spots, and they were just in the areas where I knew students were going to want to look for stuff. And I'd ask them, so if you were looking at a college website, what would you look for? I'd look for biology, and then biology, and choir, and something else. And I'd say, well, see if you can find these 2, because I knew I hadn't built the other part out, right? And just kind of watch them and see if they could get there. That, you can certainly test the terms that way. Not sure you're going to find all the high school students. I just happen to have them in my basement over a long enough period of time. Between my 2 kids, that it was like I had this built-in usability lab for about 4 years or so. It was awesome.
I'm interested in remote testing tools. Can you suggest some online resources? And also, when you get all these, what's the best way to analyze the data? Do you have to use some complicated cluster model thing? Or
The question was to do, especially like online testing.
and reverse card sorting too. There's stuff out there, but I'm not sure what's good and what's cheap.
Yeah, this one, the one that I had, the card sort was cheap, but once again, and he's fiddle-farted with it a little bit. It still works, but it has to be installed as a client on the machine. Talk to Tim Shearhouse, because his is being built to be done as a web app so that you can do it remotely, and it feeds back into a database. And he's one of my student developers. He runs the Web Authors Guild, but I'm not sure exactly how far he is on it. I've seen it work a few times. So I know time's up. Luckily, we don't have to be anywhere. I think that's the biggest issue for us doing card sorting. The analysis tools, like IBM, there's an old one floating around from IBM that you can't find on the IBM site, but it's floating around on thousands of other sites. It's just kind of because it's just a simple data analysis, right? We're just looking for clusters of cards. So that part typically isn't tough. I usually just ask a math person on campus to do it if I don't. Last time we used a tool that had it built in. That guy's card sort thing, I just took it from one tool to his other one. It just like migrates, and it prints you out a report. I would have done it by hand. We just put it in a spreadsheet, and I've like gone to the math people and went, here's what I did. Would you give me an analysis? And in a day or 2, they're like, yeah, here. Go ahead. The question was, how does the data change over time? we've done a number of these. I've seen other people do them. I think the basic, when we're talking about basic site navigation, I don't think things are really shifting very fast. Because I don't think, because of what we offer and what they're looking for, we go back to this, I'm going to tell you this thing where they look for majors first. And the entire time I've been doing research on college campus, which is a long time, I can tell you that from a print publication. Before I was doing web stuff, we knew that that's what they wanted to know. And I can tell you at our campus, they were putting out print publications. What they handed out when the admissions counselors were on the road did not have that information. And we did our first testing, that was the first thing we changed. So that really hasn't changed. Students are typically looking for the same stuff. Will those terms change? They might. That's why we have to continually, test this stuff. I'd be really interested if anybody in here does card sorts, if you'd share some of the info or just a few of the highlights. I might use it in the presentation. Really be interested in seeing somebody's research on alumni or other non-traditional groups. I mean, I really enjoy this stuff, even if they're not audiences that I typically deal with. If you do some of this, I'd love to know that. I'd love to know I think alumni are the next group I'd like to test, for example. I'd really like to know, once, A, am I getting them to the site? And once I do, kind of what are they looking for and how do they group things together?
Do you have graduate resources with data and results from?
No. I just asked if I have any reason. No, I've never gotten it. I've just gotten anecdotal stuff where I've talked to people that have done it and they said, well, here's what we kind of found out. And I'd love to see some. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I'll be around. If you've got other questions, hand in your emails. This is 6?
Yes.
UAD6. Your evaluation yourself as well. Thanks. Y'all know where to find me if you have other questions.
Can you hear from people who turn in their emails?
Yeah, I know. That sounds really interesting. Yeah. I'm really surprised it's it seems so obvious to me, but I guess.
Yeah, no, you have to step away.
Yeah. Prospective students.
I would go to your math department and ask them for, matter of fact, they might make it like a quiz. They can say, here's how the process works. They put them into groups. So it's a cognitive test of how to sort things into bundles. Ask them. They're the ones that are going to be able to do it. Yeah, because math is going to say, here's cards that show up in a group such and such percent of the time. Here's the title that shows up. Here's the second time. They're going to know how to do that. Your PR people are going to know how to do that. Yeah, when you see what the math people do, because it's going to be pretty obvious. But keep in mind, this is not free your full navigation. You still use your head. You have to think, what is this? But we give you some clues. It's really a clue. Steve can give you some clues. Yes. The language answer. Not really.